Hi, good morning. And today is the 2nd of December 2021. And every week we do a live streaming webinar for the members of our ZP Developer Zone. And I think we've been doing this for well over a year now. Well over a year. So let me just jump straight into it. So every week we do a live streaming, as I say, webinar for our ZP Developer Zone members. ZP Developer Zone is really a sort of club for startups and sort of academics who want to ask questions around biosensing, and we have lots of resources for it. We have our ZP Academy, which is the free. It has free courses on it around biosensing. I just want to say hi to Nick, and I want to say hi to Aftab and hi to Ali. Hi Ali, nice to see you. So we have the ZP Academy. We have our webinars, which is today's one of the webinars, and we have collaborations. We have one of our collaborators, in fact, is actually sorting himself out a trip to Norway, so that's kind of cool. We have our and then the ZP Developer Zone website itself. Just as an FYI, I thought I'd base today's webinar around an inquiry that we had. This is an incredibly broad question, but the question was, we require electrodes for voltammetry applications for protein detection. So this kind of sounds a bit like an immunosensor, where you have like an antibody which binds to an antigen or a protein, and that's the source of the signal. Now they say here that they want it to be voltammetry. You can do these kind of protein sensors or these immunoassays by voltammetry. You can do it by impedance spectroscopy. Of course, they want a like everyone wants, they want an electrode with high repeatability and reliability. So, and I understand where that question comes about, because not all the electrodes on the market are that way. So anyway, let me not take up all your time. Let's sort of, in some ways, just jump into it. I've got a couple of slides here. Now, when we're making sensors for proteins, we do this a lot. At any one time these days, we'll have quite a few of these kind of programs running along in parallel. We don't find it that hard to make a immunosensor. Making an immunosensor is one thing. Hi Hitcham, good to see you. Making an immunosensor is one thing. Making it, applicable in the real world is another thing. But the proof of principle is quite straightforward. So what we do is we take one of our kind of gold electrodes. We have those value electrodes. We might form a SAM layer on it. A SAM layer is self-assembled monolayer. When I look at the list of people here today, I really feel like all of you actually all know this. But just a sort of recap on, we had an inquiry. The guy says, I want to make a protein sensor. It sounds like they really want to make it an immunosensor for a protein or antigen. First step is get yourself a screen printed electrode. This is one of the ZP gold electrodes. You'll need to form probably a SAM layer on it. You'll need to now this molecule that we've used is mercaptohexanoic acid. It obviously has the thiol group on it, so the thiol group helps it bind to the gold, and it has a carboxylic acid group on the other end, and that's useful because that means that we can activate it using sort of amide coupling and EDC and NHS. This is a kind of classic amide or carboxylic acid activating chemistry. So we activate it with EDC and NHS, which activates it at this point. And then we can literally add the antibody, incubate it, and the antibody will react through one of its amine groups, and will form like essentially quite a strong amide bond. And that's super useful now that we've kind of essentially anchored the antibody onto the biosensor. There's only really one more step left, and that's to put down a blocking material. Things like chitosan or BSA are good materials, so you can actually block the gold surface, so it becomes things like non-specific binding are decreased, and then you're only left with the specific binding of the protein or antigen into that antibody. So the question is incredibly The question itself is simple. You know, it sounds simple. We want to make a sensor for detecting proteins, and they want high reliability and high repeatability. So the first thing you want to do is just get it working, and you can sort of prove out this kind of science with, as I say, a screen printed electrode. Obviously, you know, with my bias at Zimmer and Peacock, we would suggest one of our gold screen printed electrodes, and I'll put a link under the video below. You've got at least a 4-step process: forming the SAM layer, activating the carboxylic acid, doing the antibody immobilization, and then blocking the sensor off itself. And when I look at everyone who's here, I think this is nothing special to the attendees this morning, but good to see you all. I mean, we do a lot of this work. These photographs are taken from our lab. You know, so we'd sort of take these gold electrodes that we've already activated. We will add the antigen to these. We will add the antigen to these. Then we might, in a proof of principle, rinse them. So we've formed let's say the sensor in the previous step. We'll then add an antigen to the surface, let it incubate. We'll then rinse them. I mean, these photographs are literally from our lab, so you know you can see exactly what we're doing. This is a really important part here. We don't just, you know, do it one at a time. You really can't get enough sensors tested if you do it singly. Now, people do it singly because obviously, you know, these kind of parallel instruments can actually be, you know, quite expensive. You know, but we're super unusual. We do have a lot of parallel instruments, but we do test them. So we form it, now we test it, and when we test it, we add the protein or the antigen, we rinse it, and then we add on what we call a reporter molecule, and then we will actually, and I'll have to dig into what I mean by that reporter molecule in a second, but then we'll do, you know, cyclovoltammetry, differential pulse voltammetry, EIS, really, you know, anything that, well, most voltammetric methods work, but we actually prefer EIS ourselves. So what we prefer to do, I know that the question I was actually asking, you know, I want to do it by voltammetry, and that's fine, you can. It's just with time that we've discovered that we think that EIS actually gives us a better signal, and so the EIS spectrum, you know, changes both as we form the sensor. The EIS spectrum changes, but then as what we're really looking for is the idea that the more binding we get to the antibody surface, essentially, then the more block the surface is. So in the last slide, I was sort of saying, well, at the end of there, they test it. What they're doing is they're testing it often with a reporter molecule. The reporter molecule wants to get to the gold surface, and it wants to do its oxidation or its reduction. And I suppose I was actually Swansea University last week, and they were sort of, you know, when I talk about EIS analysis of immunosensors, I should then throw in, you know, two terms: Faradaic EIS and non-Faradaic EIS. So at ZP we prefer Faradaic EIS. Faradaic EIS just means we've applied enough voltage that there's some electrochemistry going on. I don't know if I'm so keen on non-Faradaic EIS. Non-Faradaic EIS suggests that you're just intrinsically measuring the electrical properties of the sensor. You've not applied enough voltage to have any electrochemistry going on, so you're just measuring the electrical properties. The only problem I have with that is you're kind of at the whim of the solution. You don't quite know what the source of your signal is, whereas when you do Faradaic, you apply a voltage, you might be oxidizing Fe2 plus to Fe3 plus. It's quite clear that is the source of the signal, and you know what you're doing. When you do non-Faradaic, you're a little bit at the whim of what else is in the solution, so you're never quite clear what your source of signal is. But we tend to do Faradaic EIS, and thanks Swansea University, because I was having that conversation last week in the labs. I'm super biased. We do tend to use these gold electrodes, and I'm super biased because we manufacture them, and we do it so much day in, day out that we've got, you know, pretty good at it. You know, these are 3 electrodes. I know you guys have seen this slide before, but you know, this is 3 electrodes tested at one protein concentration, 5 nanograms per ml up to 75 nanograms per ml. And for me, if you can ever see the signal by eye, that's a really good indication that you do have a good sensor, when you can obviously see the signal clearly by eye. I've talked here a lot about gold electrodes. You can make protein sensors also on carbon electrodes. I'm starting to become, I was always a little bit, I didn't really mind if it was gold, carbon, platinum. But to be honest with you, I am changing my mind slightly these days, because the gold prices and the platinum prices are going so high. Actually, carbon is becoming a more preferred material. I wouldn't have said that 6 months ago, by the way, so I am changing my mind on this slightly. But so far we talked about gold, now I'm flipping to carbon. There is a good paper out there that myself and a couple of the ZP guys were authors on. And in that paper, they actually used square wave voltammetry to measure a protein binding to an antibody in that particular paper. It's probably worth saying that if somebody gave us a target like protein and said, I want to make a immunosensor for this particular protein, it would generally take us about 111 hours to do that. So, now 111 hours can be several people, a project manager, a senior scientist, a technician, a project manager, there can be a lot of people, but in total it'll take us 111 hours. And we'll try to get to what we call a sort of proof of principle. So I put it like that because, it is a team effort at ZP, and I think it's actually quite hard to be an individual person making really good biosensors kind of on your own in a vacuum. So it's the strength of the team that makes us particularly efficient. When we're functionalizing the electrodes, I just want to kind of give you an idea of the workflow that we're doing. In this particular mind, I've got the idea of carbon. So what we do is, this is a bit of an unnecessary step, the first step, because actually we make really reproducible electrodes. But what we'll do is this. We'll get 60 carbon electrodes from our stock. These will be the carbon hypervalue electrodes. We'll rinse them and we'll essentially test them. And then just to make sure that we think they're good. Then we'll rinse them. We'll add on the linking molecule. So this is pyrene NHS. So if you want to know what that is, have a look at that paper. And we'll leave the linking molecule on the surface for something like 4 hours at 4 degrees C. Then we'll test them. And we'll do it's almost like a sacrifice. We'll have to take some of the electrodes and test them just to make sure that that linking step actually worked. So you start with 60 electrodes. You do the first step. You test them. But in testing, we're really sacrificing them. Then we go on to add the antibody itself, and then we test that. So every time we do this, we do cyclovoltammetry to make sure that we've functionalized, then we've rinsed, then we've tested, because we want to make sure that each step is actually working correctly. And then we will add the protein itself, and then we will, then we will add the protein itself. And then we will start actually doing the testing with that. And the reason I say that is you can see that in testing at something like 4 concentrations, we've ended up doing the actual tests themselves, but every step along the way, we are generally testing the electrodes to make sure that the step has worked, the functionalization has worked. So in order to do this correctly, you have to start with at least 60 sensors. So it's a lot of effort and it's a lot of management, because you're trying to track the fate of 60 electrodes. Think people like Ali and people like Hitcham, they've done this in the lab, so they know exactly what I mean. When you deal with half a dozen electrodes, that's one thing, but once you start trying to deal with 60, it becomes an interesting spreadsheet problem to kind of stay on top of all of this. Now, the inquirer was very interested in doing it by voltammetry, and if you read the paper that I showed earlier on, they use square wave voltammetry. One of the ZP members is really quite keen on DPV, differential pulse voltammetry. I think these days I've become more persuaded to actually use EIS. EIS used to be a technique that you couldn't necessarily apply very readily into like point of care instruments. And I know I've said it before, but actually these days you can get single chip potentiostat. So EIS is now, you know, possible. So, and I like that you can really sort of take your data sciences team and really help you extract the signal. So I do like EIS. You can extract lots of values from the equivalent circuit, and then you can look at those values and say which one of these values or which combination of values gives me the best correlation with my analyte of interest. I'm getting a little bit of an error from YouTube, so it's telling me I got bandwidth issues, but as I say, in total it takes about 111 hours to sort of do a first test. One of the questions was, you know, we want, you know, sensors that are repeatable and reliable. Now what ZP is talking about here is actually the electrodes themselves. So we do make some pretty good electrodes, and we do something called wafer mapping. So if you ever Google ZP wafer mapping, you'll get a sense that what we're doing is we're testing electrodes before we even ship them, and that means that they're actually quite high quality, and that's why you can get repeatability, reliability off our electrodes. So we're probably the only company that does this. Just want to back up slightly. When you're doing the modification or the testing, we don't just flood the electrode. We don't just put a big drop all over everything, covering up the counter working and reference. We do tend to be a little bit more precise in our application. So we actually sort of typically add like 3 little drops of 1 microliter each along the electrode, and then they coalesce to form a kind of a wet patch like this. So this is kind of how we do our functionalization. We don't like to throw the materials all over the electrodes. We like to be a bit more accurate. Yeah. FTAB, you're right. Carbon SPs are good for commercialization projects. I do agree with that. By the way, we don't we do hand pipette, but we do tend to use robots to do this as well. So it gets a little bit trickier to repeat some of this work. It's probably worth saying as well that when we're doing evaporation, we'll control the evaporation pressure, or the pressure above the electrodes, and we'll also control the temperature as well. So if you can't control conditions in your manufacturing, then you won't have a repeatable, reliable sensor. I mean, that's a take home there. I said it earlier on, when we're doing this kind of work, we generally aren't doing, you know, one sensor at a time. We are often doing, you know, 12 sensors at a time quite easily. When I say controlled environment, it's a little bit more severe than just controlling the conditions. I mean, we literally are doing it these days in class 7 clean rooms. If you can't, you know, one piece of dust could affect a sensor, and you could, you know, too much dust, for example, and you know your data will be all over the, will be very messy, and it will be very confusing, and so the time spent in the lab could be quite wasted. So we're very strict on the control of our environment, and it's part of being ISO 13485. So I'm just looking at the time now, and it's not too bad. So thanks very much, Aftab and Hitcham and Ali, for your comments this morning, and thank you, Nick, for coming online. I just want to kind of say, so we got this inquiry, and it said, you know, we require electrodes for voltammetry applications to do protein testing. So, you know, if I was to reflect that question back, then it sounds like you want to make an immunosensor. I would suspect, I would agree with Aftab that these days I would actually suggest the hypervalue carbon electrodes, and if you're going to do voltammetry, then probably square wave and differential pulse voltammetry are probably the ones to try. But actually we would also expand it out to do EIS as well. Now the electrodes have high repeatability and reliability. I like saying this, I sound so boring to myself. The reason that we actually make such good electrodes is because we genuinely use these electrodes. We are the biggest consumer of these electrodes by far. So when we sell these electrodes on the website, it's not because that revenue is nothing compared to the revenue that we make by actually using the electrodes ourselves. So that's why they're actually quite reliable and repeatable, because we're the biggest users of them. So that's why our electrodes are very different it's because our business model is very different. Our business model is, we are not a manufacturer of screen printed electrodes so other people can use them. We are manufacturers of screen printed electrodes that we use, and then we sell them to other people as well. Yeah, well, thanks, Ali. I appreciate the comment this morning. So I am going to sort of wrap up now, but really nice to chat with you guys. I really like the fact that, you know, it's the same guys, and it's good that, you know, we always come together. And I know I correspond with you all separately as well, but it is good to have a see you all together today and catch up with you soon. And I just want to kind of say one thing to FTAB, it might be worth sending this video to the Inquirer. All right, take care, guys, and I will speak to you all soon, and take care of yourselves. Have a good weekend. All right, thanks, guys. Bye-bye.